Hello and welcome back to another episode of On the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Rihanna. When thinking of the order in which to tackle the stories within Steve Biko's story, the people that were in his life and had their own rich lives, I felt it appropriate to start with the man captured with Biko on that fateful night. Peter Cyril Jones, a name most South Africans don't know, but whose life sits at the very center of one of the most important and most painful stories in the country's history. As I stated, he was in the car with Steve Biko on that night on the 18th of August, 1977, when the police stopped them at a roadblock near Grahamstown. He was arrested alongside Biko, taken to the same security police headquarters in Port Elizabeth, and tortured by the same men. He was most likely the last friendly face Biko encountered until his death. In an interview recalled in numerous accounts, Peter Jones said, "Steve's death left me with no words. It was a tear that refuses to drop." Unlike Biko, he survived. He survived 533 days of detention, solitary confinement, and repeated assault. He survived a banning order, and he lived long enough to tell the world, in his own voice, exactly what happened in those interrogation rooms. He died on the 14th of February 2023 at his home in Pringle Bay in the Western Cape. He was 72 years old. He had been suffering from the effects of a stroke that happened in 2019. He died on Valentine's Day, which people who knew him remark was entirely in character. Peter Jones, it seemed, had a flair for the symbolic. This is his story, and it is a story that deserves to be told in full. Peter Cyril Jones was born on the 7th of December 1950 in Somerset West, a small town in the Western Cape, in the shadow of the Hottentottsholland Mountains, about 50 kilometers from Cape Town. Under the apartheid system's racial classification laws, Peter Jones was classified as colored or designated as colored, a category that placed him in one of the apartheid state's intermediate bureaucratic tiers, neither fully African nor white, subject to a distinct set of discriminations and restrictions that shaped every aspect of his life. Jones later described his family background as entirely non-political. This is a detail worth holding on to because it is common to the biographies of many people who became deeply committed activists. The political awakening, when it comes, is often sudden and is often catalyzed not by theory but by experience, by injustice in its ordinary, everyday, unignorable forms. Same thing happened with Steve Biko. He completed his high school education in 1968 in the Western Cape and then enrolled at the University of Western Cape, an institution established by the apartheid government specifically for colored students, physically and administratively separate from the white universities. It was like the University of Natal's non-European section where Steve Biko studied, a facility defined by exclusion from the mainstream. And it was for exactly that reason a place where the politics of exclusion were felt and debated with particular intensity. At UWC, Jones encountered the South African Students' Organization, SASO. This was the organization that Steve Biko had co-founded the previous year in 1969 at the University of the North. SASO was spreading rapidly across black campuses, and Jones became part of the work of establishing its first branch at the University of the Western Cape. He was, from the beginning, a doer rather than a theorist, a person who got things organized, who made things happen, who turned ideas into structures. In 1969, Jones attended the conference, a national SASO conference at the University of Natal, It was here that he had his first direct encounter with many of the national leadership of the movement, and crucially his first meeting with Steve Biko. By all accounts, Jones was immediately and profoundly affected by Biko's intellect and personality. Biko had an effect on almost everyone who encountered him directly, a quality that went beyond the persuasiveness of his ideas into something more personal and harder to define. Jones became, from that moment, a committed member of the Black consciousness movement. What did Black consciousness mean to Peter Jones specifically? There is something worth noting about the position of a colored person within the Black consciousness framework. And we spoke about this in the Biko episode. Biko's definition of Black was, as we have discussed, explicitly inclusive. It referred to all those designated non-white by the apartheid state. So that's Africans, coloreds, Indians. This was a deliberate political statement, a refusal to accept apartheid government's project of dividing the oppressed along ethnic and racial subcategories. Jones understood this, embraced it, and spent his life enacting it. His commitment was not a narrow ethnic nationalism, but to the broader coalition of the dispossessed. Through the early 1970s, Peter Jones threw himself into the work of building the Black consciousness movement in the Western Cape with a level of energy and organizational commitment that his colleagues constantly remarked upon. He was, by his own account and by testimony by those who worked with him alongside him, not primarily a public speaker or a theorist, though he could do both. He was primarily someone who made things happen. He was a builder. In 1972, Jones joined the first branch Black People's Convention in the Western Cape, serving as its treasurer and regional organizer. The BPC, as we've discussed, was the political wing of the Black consciousness movement, the organization designed to carry Black consciousness ideas beyond the university campuses and into the broader community. While SASO organized students, the BPC was intended to reach workers, professionals, and township residents, the full range of Black South African society. Jones' role as regional organizer in the Western Cape was significant. The Cape was, in some ways, distinct territory for the Black consciousness movement. It had a large colored community with its own complex political traditions. Jones navigated this terrain with characteristic pragmatism, focus always on the practical work of community organization. Like Biko himself, Jones was committed to the principle that Black consciousness had to be more than philosophy. It had to be lived in concrete acts of community building and self-reliance. In the Western Cape, he was involved in establishing a clothing factory that was converted into a worker cooperative called Black Production, which embodied the movement's insistence on Black economic self-sufficiency. Jones had early in his activism turned his attention to a particularly urgent injustice. In 1971, he recognized that the number of Black children out of school in the Western Cape was staggering. At that time, there was only 2 high schools for African children in the entire Western Cape, one in Gugulethu and one in Langa. For a city of that size, in a supposedly developed country, this was a scandalous deprivation, entirely deliberate, as we know, entirely the product of apartheid's determination to limit Black educational opportunity. Jones founded the Waterkloof Scholarship the Waterkloof Scholarship Fund in response, an organization that raised money to send promising students to schools in the Eastern Cape, where there was greater provision. It was a practical, concrete response to a structural injustice, not waiting for the government to fix what it had deliberately broken but building an alternative around the obstruction. As the 1970s progressed and the Black consciousness movement developed, Jones made a significant personal commitment. He relocated from the Western Cape to King Williamstown, Kingsburg, to work directly alongside the band Steve Biko and the community projects centered there. This was a meaningful sacrifice. Jones was building his own life and organizational base in the Cape. To move to a small Eastern Cape town far from his origins, to work alongside a man who was under banning restrictions and constant police surveillance required a particular kind of commitment. In King Williamstown, Jones became part of the dense network of community initiatives that Biko and his colleagues were running, including Zenempilo Health Center, King Williamstown Resource Center, Leather Factory, and the Umtata Sewing and Women's Cooperation. Each of these projects was an embodiment of Black self-reliance. Each was also implicitly a challenge to the apartheid state's narrative of Black incapacity. Jones became over time one of Biko's most trusted colleagues. He was known as PC, an abbreviation of his initial that stuck with him for the rest of his life. His manner was, by most accounts, relatively quiet and unassuming. As I said, he was not the one who made the speeches. He was the one who made sure the speeches happened, who had organized the room, who had checked the logistics, who had thought through the contingencies. Professor Barney Patiana, speaking at Jones's memorial in March of 2023, said, Peter was not one of those who were the noisy ones, the frontline ones, the difficult ones, the forward ones. I remember him as a worker, a doer, the one who got things done. By 1977, Biko had been banned for 4 years. He was restricted to King Williamstown, but the Black consciousness movement was facing a crisis in the Western Cape. A growing ideological dispute in the Cape branch of the BCM between Black consciousness adherents and Marxist-orientated activists. And more broadly, the movement faced the strategic question of whether to seek unity with the other liberation organizations, the ANC and the PAC, that were operating largely in exile. Biko wanted to meet with Neville Alexander, a prominent intellectual and unity movement leader based in Cape Town, who had himself been imprisoned on Robben Island for a decade. And we have done an episode we speak about Neville Alexander. I encourage you to go listen to it, because actual fact, these men's like-mindedness, and just go watch it. I highly recommend. Good man to know about. The meeting was a significant political initiative, an attempt to begin building bridges between different strands of resistance in South Africa at a moment when the movement was under increasing pressure. It was Biko who asked Jones to come to King Williamstown to help run the local BPC offices, and it was Jones who became his companion for the Cape Town journey. The decision to make this trip, which meant Biko violating his banning order, was not taken lightly. They understood the risk. They made the calculation that the political purpose was worth it. In the early hours of the 17th of August 1977, Biko and Peter Jones set out from King Williamstown to Cape Town. They drove through the night in a borrowed Peugeot, Peter doing most of the driving because, as he recalled with some warmth, Steve was not a particularly confident driver and didn't much enjoy it. They drove over 1,000 kilometers through the dramatic landscapes of the Eastern and Western Cape, arriving in Cape Town in the early morning. The Cape Town trip did not go as planned. Neville Alexander refused to meet with Biko directly. He was concerned, not unreasonably, that the security police was monitoring Biko's movements and that a meeting between two banned individuals would be a catastrophic risk for both of them. It was Judge Fikile Bam who drove to Alexander's house with Biko sitting in the car and attempted to convince Alexander to come out and meet him. Alexander would not budge. Biko waited in the car. The meeting never happened. Jones, hearing this, felt the weight of the missed opportunity. He later said, and there are several accounts of this, that Alexander lived with the regret of that decision for the rest of his life. What would have happened? What unity might have been built? What different trajectory the movement might have taken had the meeting occurred? These are questions without answers. What we know is that Biko and Jones got back in the car and began the long drive. They set out on the evening of the 17th of August. They drove through the night, and at approximately 10 o'clock at night on the 18th of August, about an hour away from home near Grahamstown, they hit that roadblock. Jones later said clearly and directly that this was no ordinary roadblock. It was, in his words, set up precisely to stop Black consciousness leaders and comrades. There has been persistent and credible accounts that the security police knew and had been informed of Biko's trip to Cape Town, that there was an informer and that the roadblock was deliberately positioned to intercept them on the return journey. No informer was ever conclusively identified, but the specificity of the roadblock's placement and the speed with which the police recognized and detained both men suggested strongly that the arrest was not accidental. As we recounted in Biko's episode 2, the car was searched, both men were questioned, and both were driven to Port Elizabeth to the Warmer police station, where they were initially held in one cell that night. Jones remembered that the police tried to separate them immediately, but they protested and were allowed one night together. That was the last time Steve Biko and Peter Jones were in the same room. The morning after the roadblock, the two men were separated. Biko was taken to a different location. Jones was taken to the Algoa Park police cells in Port Elizabeth, known by detainees as Kunkelbos. From there, he was shuttled between facilities in a pattern the security police used deliberately, moving detainees frequently between locations to prevent them from psychologically adapting to a single environment, to keep them disorientated, isolated, and uncertain. On the 24th of August 1979, 6 days after his arrest, Jones was collected by Lieutenant Dan Siebert and other security branch officers and taken to the Regional Security Police headquarters, the Sanlam building in Port Elizabeth, the same building where Steve Biko was being held, the same building. They may have been in rooms near each other. Peter Jones never knew. He never saw Biko again after that first morning. What happened in the Sanlam building in August 1977 was not interrogation in any legitimate sense of the word. What happened was systematic torture. Peter Jones gave detailed testimony about this at the TRC amnesty hearings in 1997 and 1998, when the security police officers who had tortured him, the same men who had killed Steve Biko, applied for amnesty. His testimony was methodical, specific, and entirely credible. It is worth engaging with its details directly because the specificity is important. These were not abstract crimes. They had particular perpetrators, particular instruments, and a particular human being on the receiving end. Jones was taken to an isolated room. His clothes were removed. He was made to sit in the middle of the room on a steel chair, to which his left hand was manacled. On either side of him sat Siebert and Snyman, who began questioning him. The focus of the interrogation was a pamphlet that Biko and Jones were alleged to have distributed, a pamphlet that Jones denied knowledge of. When his denials did not satisfy the interrogators, colored police constable was instructed to put him on the bricks. Jones was made to stand on 2 half bricks and hold 2 steel chairs above his head. He was told that if he dropped the chairs, he would be punished. Then the constables were removed from the room and the senior men came in. The senior men, the same characters in this horror movie. Warrant officers Johannes Benneker and Ruben Marks and Major Harold Snyman. Peter Jones told the TRC exactly what happened next, and I'm going to let his words, as recorded in the official transcript, describe it. Because nothing I could substitute for them would be more precise. Okay. Nevold struck me on the head and back with a green hosepipe. Benneker struck me with a black hosepipe on the back and buttocks, and Snyman and Marks were delivering blows to keep me aligned in position. We were moving all around the room and falling. It ended up with my back turned to them, facing the wall, with them panting and me moaning and groaning. It's the same men, Snyman, Nevold, Marks, Benneker, and Siebert were in the room with Steve Biko in the weeks that followed. The methods Jones describes are consistent with what the medical evidence at the Biko inquest demonstrated had been done to Biko. The green hosepipe, the sustained physical assault, the men moving around the room. These are not abstract, bureaucratic violations. This is what was done to human beings in those rooms, in those buildings, by those specific people. Jones was eventually pressured into signing 2 statements, one on his political history and one on his work in the Black People's Convention. He had agreed with Steve beforehand on a cover story for why they had made the trip, that they were going to try to attend a meeting of the Cape BPC. He maintained his story, knowing it was false, knowing the police likely knew it was false, knowing that Biko was in a room somewhere in the same building being asked the same questions. Jones and Biko were held in the same complex during overlapping periods, but they were kept separate throughout. Jones later said that during his time at the various Port Elizabeth facilities, Walmer and Algoa Park, Kinkelbos, and the Sanlam building, he saw glimpses of other detainees, overheard things, tried to piece information together on what was happening to his comrades, but he never saw Biko again. He did not know in the weeks that followed his interrogation that Biko had sustained a catastrophic brain injury. He did not know about the 700-kilometer journey in the Land Rover. He did not know that Biko had died on the 12th of September 1977. Jones learned of Biko's death in a way that is in itself a measure of the cruelty of the detention system. He found out not from a prison official, not from a family member, not through any formal notification, but from other prisoners in the cell next to his. Those prisoners had been arrested for attending Biko's funeral in King Williamstown. Their protests at the funeral had landed them in the same prison where Jones was being held. Through the walls between cells, screaming and weeping until the police came and silenced him, they told him Biko was dead. Peter Jones says, Steve's death left me with no words. I sat with what can only be described as a heavy blow to the chest, a persistent pressure, an inconsolability persisting for many years. Peter Jones was held without trial for 533 days, from the 18th of August 1977 to the end of February 1979. 533 days. Under Section 6 of the Terrorism Act, no charges were necessary. No trial was required. No bail was possible. No lawyer had access. The state could hold him for as long as it chose, incommunicado, in whatever conditions it decided was appropriate. During those 533 days, he was interrogated repeatedly, not just in the immediate aftermath of his arrest, but on multiple subsequent occasions as the security police came back with new questions, new accusations, new attempts to break what information they believe he held. He spent extended periods of time in solitary confinement, real solitary confinement, not a few days, but weeks and months of it, is one of the more reliably devastating things the human mind can be subjected to. The evidence from psychology and from the testimony of those who have endured it is consistent. Extended isolation is a form of torture. It causes hallucinations, cognitive deterioration, severe depression, and lasting psychological damage. The apartheid state used it systematically, precisely because it worked, because it broke people, or tried to. Jones was not always alone. At certain points during his detention, he was moved, and at least one occasion he was held alongside Barney Patiana, one of the founding members of SASO and one of Biko's close collaborators. Diana was detained in 1977 under the wave of arrests that followed Biko's death and the banning of Black consciousness organizations in October 1977. Patiana later spoke of Jones at Jones's memorial service in Cape Town in March 2023. He remembered Jones in detention as someone who was, in his words, very tender, very withdrawn, which is perhaps unsurprising for a person who had been through what Jones had been through. But he also remembered him as determined, confident in some fundamental way that what they were enduring was the price of something real, that they were on the right side. At the memorial service, he said, Peter was determined. He was not sad or sorry. He was confident that these things happened because we were winning. Peter never forgot who he was and the family he came from. In February 1979, after 533 days, Peter Jones was released. He was not freed in any meaningful sense. He was released from prison and placed under a banning order. And he was placed under house arrest in Macassar, a small town in the Strand area of the Western Cape, near Somerset West, his birthplace. House arrests meant that Jones was confined to his home for specified hours, in many cases all night and all weekend. He could not leave the district without permission. He could not attend gatherings. His voice was once again legally silenced. The state had not been able to break him in prison, so they tried to contain him instead. But Peter Jones was not a man who could be contained for long. The activism that had brought him to King Williamstown, that had put him in that car with Steve Biko, that had kept him going or sane through 533 days of detention, that did not go away when the banning order was served. It simply found new forms. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established in 1995, Peter Jones had something to say that the commission needed to hear. He was one of the people who had been in those rooms. He had survived when his friend had not, and he had spent nearly 20 years, 2 decades, carrying the knowledge of what had been done there. Jones testified at the TRC amnesty hearings in 1997 and 1998 when Harold Snyman, Gideon Nieuwoud, Ruben Marx, Johannes Benneker, and Don Siebert applied for amnesty for the death of Steve Biko. Imagine facing them in that context. Wow. Jones appeared as a witness against them. Of course, the man who had been tortured by the same hands, who had seen the same methods, who could testify to exactly what those men were capable of and what they actually did. Jones' testimony at the TRC amnesty hearings was detailed and measured and devastating. He described the stripping of his clothes, the steel chair, the manacle, the half bricks, the hose pipes, the names of the men who held them. He described the pattern of assault, how they moved him around the room, how they took turns, how it ended with his back to the wall and the men panting and him unable to stand. The 5 officers who applied for amnesty were present or represented at those hearings. The legal teams cross-examined Jones. They attempted to undermine his account. They exceeded no better at this than they had succeeded in concealing their actions from the post-mortem evidence 20 years earlier. Jones was a credible and specific witness, and his account was entirely consistent with the physical evidence and the medical testimony from the original 1977 inquest. As we spoke about in last episode, their amnesty was refused. But as the statute of limitations had long since expired, no physical or no criminal prosecution followed. The men who had killed Steve Biko and tortured Peter Jones lived out their natural spans unprosecuted and uncharged. This outcome, truth without justice, was exactly what Nsiki Biko, Steve's widow, had predicted and feared. She had refused to participate in the TRC process from the beginning, arguing that truth-telling without accountability was not reconciliation, but impunity given a more palatable name. Jones did not go so far in his public statements, but he understood the weight of the failure. One of the most significant recent developments in the Biko story came in September 2025, a development that Jones did not live out to see, but which vindicated his decision to testify. The National Prosecuting Authority of South Africa on the 12th of September 2025, 48th anniversary of Biko's death, announced the reopening of the inquest into his killing. The Minister of Justice had approved a request by the National Director of Public Prosecutions, supported by the Biko family's legal representative, to reopen proceedings. The goal of the reopened inquest is to place before the court the full body of evidence, including the admissions made at the TRC, and to seek a formal finding that Biko's death was brought about by an act or omission that amounts to criminal offense. This would potentially pave the way for prosecution. Many of the perpetrators are now dead or elderly, but the principle that the killing of Steve Biko was a crime and that a court of law should say so explicitly matters enormously to the Biko family, to the BCM community, and to South African public life. Peter Jones died before this happened, but his testimony given at the TRC in 1997 and 1998, specific and unflinching, is part of the evidentiary record, and that makes this reopening possible. Peter Jones did not disappear after the banning order was lifted. He did not retire from public life or retreat into private grief. He continued, in a quieter register perhaps, but with the same fundamental commitment to the self-reliance, community building that had defined his activism from the beginning. From 1980 onwards, Jones became a founding trustee of Masifundise Development Trust, an organization focused on the rights and livelihoods of small-scale fishing communities along the South African coastline. This was, in some ways, a continuation of exactly the work he had done in the BCM era. Not high-profile political campaigning, but grassroots community organization, the building of capacity, the defense of dignity and rights of people who were marginalized by dominant economic political systems. Masifundise worked with small-scale fishing communities in the Western Cape and over time nationally, fighting for the rights of these communities to access the coastlines and fishing grounds that had sustained them for generations against the pressure of commercial fishing interests and regulatory frameworks that consistently favored larger operations. Jones remained an active trustee until his health began to fail in 2019. He was also involved in ASAPO, the Azanian People's Organization, which had been established in 1979 as the BCM's successor political organization after the apartheid government's banning of SASO, the PPC, and the Black Community programs in October 1977, immediately after Biko's death. Jones served as deputy president of AZAPO, carrying the Black consciousness philosophy forward into the post-apartheid political landscape. Perhaps more than anything else in the post-apartheid years, Peter Jones served as a keeper of memory. He was, as numerous tributes at his death observed, the last Black person to have seen Steve Biko alive. He carried that fact with him, not as a burden exactly, but as a responsibility. When journalists asked him about Biko, he answered. When educators wanted to understand the BCM, he spoke. When the TRC needed him to testify, he testified. He remained close to the Biko family, Tinsiki, and to Steve's son, Nkosinati and Samora. Nkosinati Biko, who has continued his father's legacy through the Steve Biko Foundation, spoke at Jones's state funeral. He said that Jones had earned the right to a provincial commemoration. That was measured, dignified way of saying this man's life was worth honoring publicly and officially. Jones's wife Ingrid, who was with him through his final years of illness and who delivered what observers describe as a remarkable address at the St. George's Cathedral commemorative service in Cape Town on the 10th of March 2023, spoke about the man who had never lost the thread of what he believed in, who had never let the trauma define him more than the commitment, who had, in her words, kept his infectious smile alive even through 4 years of stroke-related illnesses. Ingrid Jones said at the memorial, he was the life of any party, loved his coffee and jazz music while smoking his pipe. Peter Cyril Jones died on the 14th of February 2023 at his home in Pringle Bay following a stroke. He was 72 years old. His death was announced by heritage activist Patrick Tariq Millet, who had been among his closest comrades in years that followed his release from detention. Afforded. That's him. The South African government accorded him a state funeral, official recognition of his contribution to the liberation struggle. Among the speakers at the St. George's Cathedral commemorative service was Dr. Mampela Rampela, Professor Bonnie Patiana, Nkosinati Biko, and representatives of AZAPU, where he had served as deputy president. Members of AZAPU came from across the country in the yellow shirts to accompany his cortege through the streets of Cape Town. His ashes were scattered at sea, which is, for a man who had spent his later years fighting for the rights of fishing communities along the same coastline, a fitting end of completion. Peter Jones, as one young South African commented at the time of his death, exactly the kind of person whose name that should be known and whose story should be told. He was not a secondary character. He was not simply the man who was in the car with Biko. He was a full person, a principled activist, a committed organizer, a tireless community builder, a courageous witness, and a survivor who used his survival to continue the work. There is something in his story that speaks to a particular kind of courage, not the dramatic courage of the moment of arrest, but the sustained courage of the years that followed, the courage to testify at the TRC when it would have been easier to stay silent, the courage to continuing to organize in communities when the movement that had given his activism the framework had been devastated, the courage to carry the memory of his friend accurately, faithfully, without embellishment or self-pity for the 45 years between Steve Biko's death and his own. As I said, he described Biko's death as a tear that refuses to drop. It is one of the most precise emotional images I've encountered in all of the testimony around this story. Not weeping because weeping has a release, a completion. A tear that refuses to drop is a permanent, suspended grief, felt every day, never discharged. Peter Cyril Jones carried that grief with dignity, with purpose, and with what everyone who knew him described as an unfailing warmth, humor for the rest of his life. This is not a small thing. This is, in its own way, a form of heroism. Peter Cyril Jones, born on the 7th of December 1950 in Somerset West, died the 14th of February 2023 in Pringle Bay. He was the last person to see Steve Biko alive. He told the truth about what he witnessed. He continued building a better South Africa until he could no longer walk. His ashes are in the ocean and the work continues. What an amazing person. What an amazing legacy to leave behind. The helping. It's really interesting to me that the concepts around Black consciousness made these men better community members because they believed in self-reliance and building confidence among the people and building sustained economic self-reliance. And because of that, they did a lot of community work to get Black professionals to work in these organizations and then assist their communities in getting better and fighting for what they wanted. It really is heartwarming that a life that could have been ended the same as Steve Biko could have been ended by a broken spirit because of what happened to him and his house arrest and his banning order and his assault and his beatings, all of those things could have made this man bitter. But when he came out of all of that, all he did was fight for his people. It's really to take that page out of his life and go, we can. We just have to be psychologically strong and get ourselves there and believe more in ourselves. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget this name. Like it says, he wasn't just the guy that was next to Steve Biko that night. He was a fully formed human who lived the theories into practice. Thank you. Bye.